There comes a time when silence is dishonesty, wrote Frantz Fanon in 1956. That is what we in PRISM, the faculty group Perspectives on Race, Identity, Sexuality, Multiculturalism, felt last spring as we organised a teach-in entitled Rights and Responsibilities of Citizenship in Times of Crisis, just before the shock and awe of the US and British bombardment of Iraq. The focus of that teach-in was civic duty in the context of homeland security and the Patriot Act, and the importance of a careful, rigorous political analysis of the Middle East. Today's speaker, Noam Chomsky, could not be at that forum, but he promised to come in the fall. Thus, it could be said, in response to the Bush administration's permanent war, we are continuing that teaching. The outcomes of the war in Iraq are sadly and frighteningly even worse than what was predicted in the spring by such critics as Noam Chomsky, Robert Fisk and Edward Said. We are faced with an unelected president who fights the terrorism of desperation with exponential terror, who in the name of freedom and security is determined to limit and undermine the freedom and security of much of the world, including Americans, especially those critical of his regime. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which are now supposedly ended, continue under other names. In Iraq, the number of American soldiers killed now outnumber those killed during the official war. While Iraqi demonstrators are shot and suspected insurgents are bombed from a distance, Iraq remains debilitated by 10 years of UN sanctions. In other words, though President Bush is currently painting a Panglossian picture, that is, this is the best of all possible worlds, that increasing US, Italian and British casualties are the result of success, it is an increasingly threadbare rhetoric. The weapons of mass destruction that fueled the political justification for war have not been found. The building of democratic institutions that fueled the moral imperatives for war as much as they could be built by an occupying army or even by writing a constitution will no longer even be attempted. The transition, as quickly as possible, will be to an amalgam of opportunists, both old and new, including parts of the old Ba'athist military. While French Orientalists argue that the problem with the Bush administration and its Pentagon think tanks is that they don't understand the Arab, both agree that Arab culture is impervious to modern democracy. Yet, despite what you read in the press and see on TV, and we never hear the voices of real people living in the Middle East, and in opposition to the wishes of the region's ruling classes, there is, in fact, a diverse array of opinion, from fundamentalist to communist, represented in newspapers and satellite channels on television. On the world stage, the state-sponsored violence of Bush and Blair, as many commonsensically predicted, has resulted in increased rather than decreased violence. The world knows, at least as is reported by Europeans in answers to questionnaires, and at least as seen on the streets of London last week, that we live in a much more dangerous place because of the actions of Bush and Blair. As desperate acts become the language of the politically disenfranchised, and the perverse reciprocity of the bombers suffocates alternatives. At home, we are faced with the continual double talk from the administration that things are going along swimmingly as the body count rises. It has become patently clear that all the troops must be withdrawn immediately, yet that only leads us back to the air war mindset. It's okay to bomb others as long as our own aren't bombed or killed. More fundamental political and policy changes are needed then. More needs to be rethought than simply bringing back the troops. For US geopolitical and economic interests remain the determinant. It is no accident that as billions are doled out in corporate reconstruction benefits, the numbers of working poor and the middle class without health insurance in the United States has reached record levels. Yet this calls for more than dusting off the old jobs not bombs slogan. It means getting beyond the Manichaean mediocrity and the mindset of much of the mass media, both conservative and liberal. There is a tradition and a history of anti-war movements that we should reacquaint ourselves, a tradition to which I think Noam Chomsky belongs, which, in Rosa Luxemburg's words, define being human as throwing oneself on the scales of destiny. One can think of a long list of Americans, from John Brown to Martin Luther King, from Sojourner Truth to Eugene Debs, and Rachel Corrie, who took this as a moral duty. A categorical imperative haunts our present period. The question is, what should be done to stop the process of destruction and dehumanization, in other words, a so-called war against terror, which is presently a permanent global condition? I mention Rachel Corrie not simply as a young person who had decided to join the international solidarity movement and, in effect, risked her life attempting to protect Palestinian houses from demolition, but also the fact that she was killed by a 60-ton American-made bulldozer. That should give us pause. I mention her, and you can read her letters full of humanity and reciprocity and feeling in the British newspaper The Guardian. I mention her as a representative of a new global consciousness and conscience among American youth. This is not simply a call to action, for the issue here is how to engage the uninformed, to change the epistemological framework of ethnocentrism and narcissism that is most powerfully reproduced in the way the propaganda and media of war touches our lives. As an educational institution involved in communication and the media, it is also a call to plumb the underground of the mind, to reflect critically, clearly and empathetically, and to connect to the multiple situations out of the primary narcissism of our sequestered college lives. The Columbia University literary scholar and fierce advocate for Palestinian self-determination, Edward Said, who died recently, articulated this in his last essay for the weekly Egyptian paper El Haram. He encouraged us to press for more exacting, a more demanding kind of discussion in which terms are defined from numerous viewpoints and are placed in concrete historical circumstances. Certainly, this demanding, exacting and clarifying type of discussion is one ongoing goal. It emphasizes critical thinking and intersubjectivity. It emphasizes the other's agency and humanity at home and abroad, and thus it builds on understanding and critical self-reflexivity. It thus also, for those of you and us who work in the media industry, is an ethics which therefore leads to praxis. It is especially fitting that the speaker tonight, who is one of the foremost critics of the media propaganda machine, is speaking at a school which prides itself on excellence and the skill of communication and in the media. Noam Chomsky probably needs no introduction. He is one of a shamefully small group of academics who are critical public intellectuals. He is a polymath, a leader in distinct fields, and he has been an activist against war and for social justice for many decades. He has written and lectured widely on linguistics, philosophy, intellectual history, contemporary issues, international affairs, and US foreign policy. Noam Chomsky has been prolific. His most recent books are Rogue States, 9/11, Understanding Power, On Nature and Language, Pirates and Emperors, Old and New, The Faculty of Language, What is it, Who has it, and How did it evolve, Chomsky on Democracy and Education, Middle East Illusions, and Hegemony or Survival. This evening, he will speak to us on the topic of propaganda and war, Iraq and Belong. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I'm a little bit late, but you have a very confusing building. If anybody can find room 506 by getting in on 120 Boylston Street, they deserve a PhD for that alone. I didn't, but I was rescued. The title, Iraq and Beyond, makes a good deal of sense. We should be thinking about the future and what we can do to direct it in some favorable course. However, when the word beyond does open a sort of a trap that we should be aware of, and it's particularly striking in the United States. There's a very deep-rooted feature of U.S. intellectual culture that one should be aware of. It's sometimes called the doctrine of change of course. The idea is that in the past, this doctrine is invoked every 2 or 3 years. We've just seen a remarkable invocation of it a few weeks ago, which I'll get back to. The doctrine says, well, yes, in the past we did various unpleasant things out of inadvertence or inattention, but now we're changing course, so we can put all that stale, boring stuff behind us, forget about it, forget the fact that we suppressed or denied it when it was taking place, and march on to a glorious future. The most recent incarnation of the doctrine was a few weeks ago when the President announced a dramatic new change, new course in the U.S. Role in world affairs, in particular in the Middle East. Namely, from now, we realize that in the past we'd supported repressive and brutal regimes and undermined democracy and development, although it was always denied while it was going on. But now we will work to bring democracy to the Middle East. Exciting new development. Greeted with great awe and respect, verging on reverence in the U.S. media, and with ridicule in most of the rest of the world, in particular in the Middle East. Somehow the victims don't find it quite as easy to toss history, including current history, into the ash can, and they pay some attention to it. And we probably should too. It's convenient for those who have the guns. For those who are engaged in ongoing criminal enterprises, it's an extremely convenient doctrine. It's also cowardly and dishonest and very serviceable. Part of one of the services it performs is to make sure that we will understand essentially nothing about what's happening and what's developing and what's going to develop. And in particular, we won't see, as others do, the persistent tendencies that go on with changes of rhetoric and regular decisions to forget everything that came before. And they go on because they are for very elementary reasons. Policies are rooted in institutions. There's some variation, but if the institutions are stable, the policies don't change very much. It's been true for a long time. The institutions are stable, and we can therefore expect much of the same in the future. If it changes dramatically as proclaimed, that'll be wonderful, and everyone will cheer, but nobody's expecting it, at least nobody who isn't writing editorials and commentaries in the U.S. press. And there are good reasons for it, especially in the Middle East, in Latin America, and elsewhere. I'll come back to them if there's time. Well, as you know, and this was just pointed out, the last couple of days, the President was in London. It was quite a remarkable event, in fact, historically without any precedent. I don't think there's been a time when there have been times when U.S. presidents were greeted with protests and demonstrations, say in Latin America or other places, victimized by a century of U.S. brutality, which we are supposed to forget. But it's never happened before in an allied country, in fact, in the sole allied country. The mayor of London greeted the president, as you probably read, by describing him as the greatest threat to life on this planet that we've most probably ever seen. One of the leaders of the huge protest marches that took place said that no visitor to England has ever been so unwelcome since William the Conqueror. And many others expressed similar sentiments, all quite without precedent. And whatever you think about the sentiments, any sane person who cares about the fate of the world will pay attention to them, won't ignore them. In fact, they're not so new. About a year ago, we were hearing the same thing, maybe not quite as strident, but similar. This began, you can see the real change, in September 2002, when quite a few important things happened. One thing that happened was that the Bush administration announced its national security strategy, declaring quite brazenly and simply that it intended to dominate the world by force permanently and would not tolerate any challenge to that domination. The doctrine has precedents, but it had never been expressed in this fashion before, and it aroused many shudders around the world. Simultaneously, the administration effectively announced that it was going to invade Iraq without credible pretext and without international authorization. And within a couple of weeks, in fact, by October of last year, the mainstream press here was pointing out unhappily that in much of the world there's greater fear of the United States than there is of Saddam Hussein. Actually, that was an understatement. In the rest of the world, Saddam Hussein was despised and reviled, and there are plenty of people who'd be happy to see him torn limb from limb, but he didn't inspire any fear outside the United States. The U.S. was off the international spectrum in this respect. That's true even in the countries that Saddam Hussein had invaded, Kuwait and Iran, the neighboring countries that he'd invaded, and with devastating consequences. Of course, he was hated. They'd be happy to see him, I say, torn to shreds, but they didn't fear him. In fact, for years they had been trying to reintegrate Iraq back into their regional system over strong U.S. objections. And the reason they didn't fear him is very simple. They knew perfectly well, just as Washington knew, and journalists and commentators knew, that Iraq was the weakest country in the region. It had, as you just heard, been devastated by 10 years of sanctions, which had a horrendous effect on the population, probably killed hundreds of thousands of people, left the society in shreds, strengthened the tyrant, forced the population to become more dependent on him. The country was also essentially disarmed. The United States would never have attacked it if that hadn't been the case. And it was maybe a horrible place internally, but no threat to anyone. That was well understood. It was only in the United States that Iraq was considered a threat, and that happened very quickly. It happened after the massive government media propaganda campaign that began in September 2002. Within a few weeks, a majority of Americans thought that Iraq was a serious threat to the security of the United States. Majority believed that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction, that it was responsible for 9/11, that it was planning new atrocities. Those beliefs were held nowhere in the world. They're still held, interestingly. The most recent polls show about 70% still believe that Iraq was pursuing programs of weapons of mass destruction, even though the evidence is overwhelming that that hadn't been true for years since the U.S. had been supporting them back in the 80s, and that Iraq is tied up with terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. Those are major achievements of propaganda, and they do distinguish the United States from the rest of the world dramatically since last September. However, these attitudes that you're now hearing on the streets of London were already being expressed a year earlier, shortly after the national security strategy was announced and the war was declared. There was a European Union poll a couple of weeks ago, also just mentioned, which found that people ranked the United States, North Korea, and Iran at the same level as threats to peace, the highest ranking as threats to peace in the world. Actually, not quite the highest ranking. Right above them was Israel. But I suspect that that's a result of the fact that the question was not properly asked. You have to be rather careful with polls because people are not always answering the question that was asked. Israel alone is no threat to peace, but Israel, with U.S. support, is an enormous threat to peace. Even the U.S. Strategic Command recognizes that. And I suspect that what people were answering, the question they were answering was when they were asked what's the greatest threat to peace, is U.S.-backed Israeli policies, which are inflaming the region and regarded as extremely dangerous elsewhere, and right below that, the United States itself. If that's in fact what they were answering, which I think is likely, then they probably are recognizing something that is also pretty well understood outside the United States. It was just articulated by one of the most astute contemporary historians who deals with the contemporary Middle East, De La Piro, in a forthcoming book, who points out that what actually happened in Iraq, I'm quoting him, what actually happened in Iraq is something deadlier than the worst scenarios sketched by the pessimists. The invasion of Iraq has led to an alliance of Arab nationalism with Islamic militancy, steering both towards a very ominous amalgam in the region and the world. And in fact, you're seeing it in the headlines day after day around the region, and it's expected to extend to the world. And it's also understood that another factor in creating that deadly amalgam is U.S. support for Israeli policies of undermining the possibility for a political settlement of the Israel-Arab conflict by carrying out development programs within the occupied territories that effectively make it impossible for any political settlement to eventuate, a matter of great concern throughout the world outside the United States and backed by the United States. And furthermore, these are policies that have been going on for 30 years, but we're supposed to forget all that under the doctrine of change of course, even though it continues today. Well, facts are stubborn little things, and they're easy for the rich and powerful to forget, but not so easy for the people at the wrong ends of the guns to forget, and they respond. And if we want to understand the world, we should pay some attention to that. With regard to Iraq itself, it was predicted by Western intelligence agencies and independent specialists almost universally that the invasion of Iraq would very likely lead to an increase in terror and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. The reasons for that are quite simple. Didn't take a genius to figure them out. When you announce publicly that you're going to attack anyone you feel like and destroy them if they're defenseless, they're not going to react by saying, thank you, here's my throat, please cut it. What they'll do is figure out some way to defend themselves. And while no one can begin to compete with the United States at the level of armaments, the U.S. spends approximately as much as the rest of the world combined and is technologically far more advanced, there are weapons which are available to the weak, too: terror and weapons of mass destruction. They happen to be available to the weak. So it's to be expected that they will proliferate, both of them, as a result of the invasion, and that's exactly what's happened. There's been further proliferation, and as expected, and you just have to read the papers every day to see that there's an explosion of terror everywhere, probably linked in some loose way to the al-Qaeda network, but a reflection of exactly what was predicted. On the one hand, revenge, on the other hand, deterrence. People know there is no other way to deter the United States unless its citizens succeed in deterring it from within, which of course is the best hope. That's in your hands. The attitudes expressed in Europe are much more extreme in most of the rest of the world. And in fact, George Bush has one major achievement to his credit. Within 2 years, he has turned his administration into the most feared and disliked, even hated administration, not only in the world, but in recent history outside of moments of direct aggression. That's a pretty remarkable achievement, and it's not a cheerful note for the future. I should say that the administration is just as aware as its critics that acts like the invasion of Iraq or the national security strategy that underlie it, that such actions are going to very likely increase the threat of terror and weapons of mass destruction. That means threats to Americans as well, because sooner or later they'll be united. And there will be weapons of mass destruction used in terrorist attacks in the United States. It's very likely and widely expected. They know that perfectly well, and they don't want that outcome, but it just doesn't matter very much. It's not a high priority as compared with others, such as the priority of dominating the world by force and implementing and hanging on to their very narrow hold on political power by frightening the population enough to get by the next election so that they can pursue domestic programs which are, in effect, unraveling the entire protective system for the population that's been developed through the last century of popular struggle and progressive legislation. That's to be dismantled, and we need a powerful state, but to serve the interests of the rich and powerful. The rest can somehow take care of themselves. And those are high priorities, and if it's necessary to increase the threat of terror and maybe even destruction to the people of the United States, it's a small price to pay. I should say that in the United States as well, opposition to the policies has been without historical precedent. There's never been a time, either in the history of the U.S. or Europe, when there was such massive protest against a war before it was even officially launched. In the case of Vietnam, for example, it took years before there was even the beginnings of protest. By the time it started, South Vietnam had been, in fact, virtually destroyed. And that's the typical pattern of European and imperialism, of which the U.S. is an offshoot. This was quite different in the U.S. as well, and it extended right to elite opinion, which is unusual. So the day the bombing began, the highly respected senior historian, former Kennedy advisor Arthur Schlesinger, wrote an article in which he said that he recalled President Roosevelt's description of Pearl Harbor as a date that shall live in infamy, and he said that Roosevelt was correct, but today it is the United States that lives in infamy as it pursues the policy of Imperial Japan, pretending to undertake what's called anticipatory self-defense as a cover for outright aggression. I don't think there's ever been a time when a respected figure anywhere in the mainstream wrote anything like that, and he was reflecting a pretty broad spectrum of opinion, which went all the way over to the business world. Well, what about Iraqis? What do they think about all these things? Well, it's not so easy to figure out the opinions of people who are under military occupation, but there is evidence. There's regular polls taken, sponsored by the State Department, Western polls, and the results are interesting and certainly suggestive and pretty consistent. So, for example, one recent poll asked people whether they thought how they regarded the U.S. troops. Were they liberators or occupiers? And by about 5 to 1, they described it as an occupying force. Another poll around the same time asked people in Iraq who was their favorite foreign leader. The winner by a large margin was President Jacques Chirac of France, who was the international symbol of opposition to the war. He ranked far above Bush and Blair. Was actually reported, kind of hidden in a story, but reported, and the reporter was plainly troubled by it, New York Times, came back to it a couple of weeks later, Patrick Tyler, and he referred back to that result, and he plainly didn't understand it. He referred to it, and his only comment was, "Go figure." Well, I presume that means, what's the matter with these crazy Arabs? We come and liberate them, and their favorite foreign figure is Jacques Chirac. They don't know which end is up. I mean, there is another possible explanation, but apparently that one didn't enter. Another recent poll a couple weeks ago, people were asked whether they wanted U.S. forces to leave right away. And remarkably, by about 5-3, they said yes. That is remarkable, because with the chaos and destruction of, first of all, the war, but even worse, what's followed, if the American troops leave at this point, could be a security disaster. But nevertheless, that's the result of the poll. The most recent one asked people, this has to do with the change of course that was recently announced, asked Iraqis why they think the United States invaded Iraq. They didn't call it invade, of course, liberated Iraq or whatever the poll asked. And there were some who agreed with the near unanimous position of U.S. commentators that the goal was to bring democracy to Iraq. 1%. Well, that got some support for Mr. Bush's declaration there. There actually was a more interesting result to the poll. About half the Iraqi population in the same poll thought that the U.S. would introduce democratic forms to Iraq, but that it would make sure to maintain control over them, influence and control over the outcome. And that's a sophisticated answer based on history. There's a long history of U.S. policy, British policy, other imperial powers, even the Soviet Union, in introducing what they call democracy, sometimes even with the forms of democracy, like pushing buttons every couple of years, but making sure that it doesn't get out of hand. If it gets out of hand, the mailed fist is in the background, and it'll drive things back in the right direction. That's the history of Central America and the Caribbean for the past century. And it's sort of recognized in scholarship, even by those who try to take the democracy rhetoric seriously. It's recognized that the U.S. has been willing to accept democracies in its backyard, but only if they're what are called top-down forms of democracy in which traditional elites allied to the United States remain in power. Otherwise, you get subversion, aggression, economic strangulation, and other means to drive them back to decency. And the British were the same. When the British were running the Middle East region, as they were up until the Second World War, their policy, as described in internal documents, since declassified, was to establish what they called in each country an Arab facade of local collaborators who would govern and administer and carry out security operations and so on. But the British would be right behind the scene, behind what they called constitutional fictions of various kinds to make sure that things stayed on course. When Britain agreed in 1958 to allow Kuwait to have nominal independence. They were afraid of spreading Arab nationalism. They thought it might affect their Kuwaiti colony. They did agree to that, but in the internal discussions between the British and U.S. leaders at the time, both made clear that Britain would reserve the right, as they put it, ruthlessly to intervene if anything went off course for any reason, domestic or otherwise, and the U.S. reserved the same right in the bigger prizes, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. And that's quite traditional, and it's not really surprising that Iraqis understand it, just as Latin Americans understand it, and many others around the world. And it's also not surprising that it is not what's taught in schools in the countries where they hold the guns. They'd rather have you believe something else. That's the way to subdue your own population, one of the major primary goal, in fact, of propaganda and indoctrination. The domestic population has to be kept under control. What Alexander Hamilton called the great beast, the people, has to be kept in a cage and make sure they don't bother those with power. And that's a large part of the function of the doctrinal system, education, media, and so on. Elsewhere, the world looks different. For Iraq, this process has already begun. The U.S. occupying forces have instituted an economic program for Iraq that no sovereign country would ever accept. In effect, it turns Iraq over to foreign investors almost completely, undermines any hope that Iraqi businessmen or the population or working people or whatever will have any significant say in determining their own future. As I say, no sovereign state would ever accept such a regime, but Iraq, under military occupation, accepted it. And here it was, as usual, lauded as a wonderful step forward. When the new democracy shift was announced with the new programs for Iraq, Bush administration officials also explained that they would be combined with what's called a status of forces agreement, which ensures that the U.S. will maintain military bases and troops in Iraq as long as it wants, which means that the country stays in effect under military occupation, and that the U.S. crucially extends its basing system, which for years has been directed primarily toward the Middle East. It's where the world's energy resources are. Now, for the first time, the U.S. not only has bases in Afghanistan and Uzbekistan as a result of the Afghan war, Kosovo as a result of that war, all close to the region, first stable bases close to the region, but it's going to have big military bases right at the heart of the oil-producing region, which is very significant. It's been understood since the Second World War that the Middle East energy resources are what was called by the State Department in 1945 a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. The U.S. was going to control it, and it's been kind of like an axiom of world affairs, and now the control is extended. That doesn't have to do with access to oil. If the U.S. were to shift to renewable energy, that imperative would remain. That's a lever of world control. It yields what's sometimes called veto power over potential rivals, Europe, Northeast Asia, and others. And a lot of the maneuvering in the Middle East and Central Asia, in fact, has to do with who's going to control those resources. Well, final comment, because I'd like to keep to that schedule, which is a good one, that it's important to bear in mind that the extraordinary reaction to the Bush administration announcements of September 2002 didn't just have to do with the war in Iraq. And the same is true of the protests against the war around the world. They didn't just have to do with that war. It was well understood that the invasion of Iraq is what's sometimes called an exemplary action. That is an action undertaken to demonstrate that announced policies are to be taken seriously. The policy it's not coincidental that it was announced at the same time as the national security doctrine. The invasion put the world on notice that the Bush administration isn't just producing empty words. It means what it says. It is going to attack any country as long as it's defenseless, if it's considered valuable enough, and it's going to do it without credible pretext and without international authority. The UN was told immediately that it could be, as the administration put it, it could stay relevant by giving the United States authorization to do what it was going to do anyway, or it could turn into a debating society. Those were the two choices offered by Colin Powell, the administration moderate. And that was well understood. Furthermore, the invasion of Iraq, the announced invasion of Iraq, although the clearest illustration of an exemplary action, an action to indicate that the policy was meant seriously, it wasn't the only one. This wasn't reported, barely reported here, sometimes not at all, but plenty. But notice was taken of it elsewhere in the world, including Europe and Asia, and of course the Middle East. Shortly after, a couple of weeks after the national security strategy was announced, that's September 2002, a few weeks later, the Space Command, which is in charge of strategic weapons, announced that its program for the coming years, and it declared that the U.S. is now going to move, in its words, from control of space to ownership of space. Ownership of space means nobody comes near. The U.S. will have total ownership of space and will use it for offensive military purposes. It will establish space platforms which can be used for highly destructive weapons, nuclear and non-nuclear, which can be launched instantaneously without warning from command posts in the United States, reducing the need for forward basing of troops. And the world will be under surveillance, tight surveillance by hypersonic drones, which will be precise enough so they can tell you if a car is crossing the street in Tehran or whatever you want. That, in effect, not in effect, in reality, puts the world at mercy of instantaneous, unannounced, devastating attack. And that's public. That's not secret. It's publicly announced, and it's now being implemented. 2 days after the national security strategy was announced, September 19th, the U.S. Ordered there were negotiations going on with primarily the Europeans in trying to put enforcement mechanisms, to introduce enforcement mechanisms into bioweapons treaties. There are treaties which ban biological weapons, but they had no enforcement mechanisms. Negotiations were going on to add enforcement mechanisms. On September 19th, the administration point man, John Bolton, informed the negotiators that it was off. No more enforcement mechanisms, no negotiations for at least 4 years, if then. A few weeks later, on October 23rd, last year, 2002, the U.S. There were a conference going on of the United Nations Committee on Disarmament and International Security. It's basically the General Assembly, which tried to pass two important resolutions. One banning militarization of space, which the UN described as a grave threat to peace and security. The other, reaffirming a 1925 protocol banning poison gas and bacteriological warfare. The U.S. blocked both of them. When the U.S. blocks something, it's essentially a double veto. It's blocked and it's not reported, so it's out of history. So neither of these was reported. But the world notices. For example, Russia notices. Russia had been reducing its military expenditures, as they badly need to do with the economy having collapsed in the past 10 years. But last year it started increasing them again by about 30%. It increased its offensive military capacity, including submarines to carry nuclear torpedoes with nuclear warheads and so on. It also placed its missiles on a launch on warning, meaning automated control, which is a virtual guarantee of catastrophe because of their deteriorating command and control systems. It's well understood by the Bush administration as well that all of these moves severely increase threats at this point, threats to survival. China is reacting exactly the same way, recognizing that it's the target of these, maybe the prime target of these developments. When China increases offensive military capacity, India has to react. Pakistan has to react to India's increased offensive armaments. It has a ripple effect through the Middle East, and you're kind of off and running. All of these things are well understood. They're happening all over the world, and they also help account for the fear and, in fact, hatred of an administration which is quite consciously increasing severe threats to even to survival. I should say that that's not unusual. If you look over history, including recent history, you'll find that it's replete with examples of how leaders are willing to face severe risks, even risk to the destruction of their society, in order to achieve narrow goals of power, dominance, and wealth. It's a good part of history, nothing unusual about it here. What is unusual is the scale. By now, the issue really is human survival. The stakes are very high, and it's not at all clear how much time we have to try to reverse that course. Thanks.
To ask questions and make comments. So I'm wondering whether if people would like to start lining up in front of these mics, we can start the questions. Okay, let's go ahead.
First of all, I'm a great admirer of yours. It's just an honor to ask you a question. It's no secret that Richard Perle and Paul Wolfowitz expressed a desire in the mid to late 1990s to build a liquid natural gas pipeline in Afghanistan and a base in Uzbekistan. I know it sounds like far-out conspiracy stuff, though, but is there, in your opinion, any logic to the train of thought that this is part of some plan on their part? Or?
I mean, you're right, and it wasn't just them. In fact, Unical, which is, I think, the 10th or approximately largest oil company in the world, was negotiating with the Taliban within the framework of Clinton foreign policy, not Wolfowitz and Perle, to put a pipeline through Afghanistan. Those negotiations were terminated when the U.S. bombed Afghanistan in 1998, but it's likely that they're being resuscitated. So I think the facts are not in doubt. How significant that was in policy determination is an open question. My guess is kind of secondary. I mean, it'd be nice, for Unical to have a pipeline there and so on, but it's not really crucial. I mean, we should bear in mind that the energy reserves of the Persian Gulf, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Iraq, those are overwhelmingly the major reserves in the world. U.S. intelligence predicts that in the coming generation they'll provide about 65% of the world's energy. Central Asia is important, but it's important sort of at the level of the North Sea and Alaska and other significant but secondary sources. over Central Asia, there is a lot of jockeying going on. What just happened in Georgia is, in fact, part of it. The big question, if you keep your eyes on Central Asia, is which direction are the pipelines going to go? There's a lot of gas and oil in Central Asia. Nobody knows exactly how much, but it's not insignificant, and other resources. And the question is, are they going to go to the east, to China, Japan, Korea, or are they going to go to Western Europe under U.S. control, avoiding Russia and Iran? So rather crucial for the U.S. is that the pipelines avoid what they regard as rivals, Russia and Iran. And the pipeline through Afghanistan would be part of the way of avoiding those threats, would remain under U.S. control. So you just take a look at the map and you'll see pretty well what's going on. Most of the conflict in that region, and it's serious, is either in oil-producing regions or in regions that are they're part of the oil delivery system, like Chechnya, Georgia, last couple of days, and so on.
If we're able to do that to gain control of Afghanistan and Iraq, is it possible that a plan like that could work out well, or could it only be an ongoing disaster?
Ongoing struggle inside, you mean? Yeah, well, it's a matter of how hard it is to protect pipelines while the country is being torn to shreds. It's kind of a technical problem. Actually, the same thing's going on in Colombia, another significant, not huge, but significant oil-producing region. In fact, the whole Andean region is in turmoil, Venezuela down to Bolivia. And if there is going to be another U.S. intervention, I suspect it will very likely be there. That's one of the regions which the U.S. has been depending on as a potential source of energy for itself. Persian Gulf wants to control, but at least you can believe U.S. intelligence projections. They predict that the U.S. itself will rely on more stable Atlantic Basin resources, that is, Western Hemisphere and West Africa. A lot of what's going on in West Africa has to do with this. And the Andean region is crucial to it. Venezuela is a huge oil producer, and Colombia is a significant one. And some of the problems there are protecting the pipelines from guerrilla attack. That's why the U.S. has so many troops down there and supporting the military and the paramilitary. Colombia, which has the worst human rights record in the hemisphere by far, has also been the leading recipient of U.S. military aid throughout the last decade, increasing very sharply in the late 90s and remaining very high. And the whole region is by now surrounded by U.S. military bases in Ecuador, in the Dutch islands, and El Salvador. In fact, I think there's more U.S. military forces there now than there have ever been, and that's misleading because a lot of the military support is privatized. So now there are what are called private corporations like DynCorp and MPRI, which consist of either retired U.S. military officers or mercenaries and are completely funded by the Pentagon, but are called private. And they carry out the chemical warfare programs in Colombia that are called fumigation, and they do training of military training and so on. They're doing the same in the Balkans, and they will pretty soon in Iraq and so on.
My last question is three people I admire are you and Bucky Fuller and Carl Sagan. Bucky Fuller and Carl Sagan are obviously
I didn't hear.
R. Buckminster Fuller and Carl Sagan and yourself are three people that I admire. And obviously they're no longer with us. But what young people do you see kind of stepping forward and taking those types of roles, anti-nuclear? Or...
Well, there's been a tremendous increase in activism among young people, and in fact the whole society in the last 30 or 40 years, and it's still continuing. I mean, Rachel Corrie is an example. The International Solidarity Movement is quite a dramatic, important movement. There's never been anything like that in the history of Western imperialism. There's never been a time when people from the imperial countries went to try to protect the victims, their victims. I mean, that didn't happen, say, in the British or French Empire. Certainly didn't happen in Vietnam. Nobody even dreamed of it. Actually, it began in the 80s in the United States and right in mainstream U.S. Groups like Witnesses for Peace and others who were still very active went mostly to Central America then to live with the victims, to help them and try to protect them. The idea would be a white face would protect them from U.S.-backed state terrorists. They came out of the evangelical movements first, and they were very brave and courageous people. I still meet them all over Central America and other places, and they've now extended to the Middle East, and Rachel Corrie's group is one of the outgrowths of that. And that's just that's just on the surface. If you take a look at the global justice movements, the movements that are called, it's a ridiculous term, but are called anti-globalization movements in the propaganda system, basically global justice movements. They are really inspired and to a large extent led by young people all over the place. In the rest of the world, too. The United States is there's a reason why the meetings of the World Social Forum, the main grouping of these, are in Brazil and now in India. The reason is that the impetus for it primarily comes from the South, but the North has joined in, and that's significant. It's an international movement with plenty of young people. The same is true of environmental movements and lots, anti-sweatshop movements and lots of others. So they're all over the place.
Thank you.
Hi. I'd also like to thank you for coming to speak here and congratulate you on the lack of pro-Zionist protesters at this particular event. It was my understanding that was a regular facet of a Noam Chomsky speech, and I was surprised, almost a little disappointed. But I have about 1 billion questions I want to ask, but in the interest of time, I'll just stick to the one that has been sort of foremost on my mind. When this war began, I had heard rumors, which I was not able to find any hard evidence on, that supposedly France's opposition was based on some sort of fear that any weapons we find might be linked to them. Which
France's fear? Whose fear? France?
France's, yes. I couldn't find any evidence on this, and this doesn't make any sense to me personally, because if anything, I would think they would want us to stop snooping around Iraq and start bombing them if this was true. But it did raise a question in my mind of what exactly France's opposition was linked in, because I guess recent events have sort of jaded me to the point where I don't really expect to find a government administration, really opposing a war for moral reasons. So I was wondering if you knew if there was any sort of self-interest involved.
There was self-interest, all right. France had, as far as weapons of mass destruction are concerned, they would have been found from everywhere, including the United States. The U.S. was providing Saddam Hussein with dual-use technology, which could be used and was used to develop weapons of mass destruction right up to the day of the invasion of Kuwait. The British were a little slow on the draw, and they kept providing them even a couple of days later. And this was long after Saddam Hussein's worst atrocities were perfectly well known. It was long after the war with Iran. It had nothing to do with Iran. In fact, the Bush #1 administration announced quite publicly why they were doing it. It wasn't reported, but they announced it. They said we're doing it for two reasons. First of all, it's our responsibility to assist U.S. exporters. And secondly, providing aid, including military aid to Saddam Hussein, will improve the human rights situation and improve the stability of the region. It's on the public record. The Iraqi, you remember last December 8th, I think, Iraq provided some huge document to the United Nations, sort of supposedly describing all of its weapons of mass destruction programs, big event. The U.S., if you recall, stole that document before it was distributed to the United Nations and edited it, and then provided it to the permanent members, but kept it away, theoretically, but kept it away from the other members. And according to many credible reports, including Dilip Hero's book, which I just mentioned, apparently they edited out of it material which was circulated in the European press. about the role of U.S. corporations in supporting Saddam Hussein's weapons programs right up to the last minute. So, yeah, you'd probably find French weapons and German weapons and Russian weapons and U.S. weapons and, everybody. During the period of Saddam Hussein's worst atrocities, the gassing of the Kurds and all that, everybody was trying to get a piece of the action to make some money out of it. And so, yes, you'd find all of those. As far as France is concerned, they also, like the United States and Russia and others, were making various deals with Iraq in one fashion or another to use Iraqi oil. I think the U.S. was actually probably the major importer of Iraqi oil in the 90s through Dick Cheney's Halliburton under various covers. So you find all sorts of things. You're right that France, like anyone else, is, it's no system of power. Systems of power are not moral agents. States are not moral agents any more than businesses are. They act out of the interests that they represent. People are moral agents. Institutions aren't. So, France isn't doing it out of the goodness of their heart, but for whatever motives they had. However, it is striking, and we ought to think about this, it's striking how the question arises in the United States. The question that constantly arises is why France, Germany, Turkey, and so on didn't go along with the United States. What was their hidden motive? Actually, it's a curious question, because the fact of the matter is that it was just about nowhere in the world where there was more than maybe 10% support for the U.S. invasion. Now, that was shown in Gallup polls last December, which were never published, but they're there. You can find them. No country polled around the world, I think, did they get more support than 10%. So the only difference among countries was, would the government go along with the vast majority of the population, or wouldn't they? And it's very striking to see the way that cut was made. You recall the discussion about old Europe and new Europe. Old Europe, the bad guys, were supposed to hate France and Germany, wonder what kind of cynical things they're up to. The good guys are Berlusconi in Italy and Aznar in Spain and Hungary and Latvia, who went along with the United States. They're the good guys. Hope for the future. Well, what was the criterion that distinguished the good guys from the bad guys? It's very straightforward. The bad guys, like France and Germany, the governments went along with a large majority of the population. The good guys, like Berlusconi and Aznar, opposed the will of an even greater majority of the population and took their orders from Crawford, Texas. So they're the hope for democracy. The most striking example was Turkey and Paul Wolfowitz, who's the great visionary who everyone's supposed to revere for his love of democracy. In Turkey, 95% of the population were opposed to participating in the invasion. And to everybody's surprise, the government actually went along with them. And they were bitterly denounced. Colin Powell immediately announced they were going to be punished. Editorials were denouncing Turkey for its lack of democratic credentials, literally, because the government was going along with 95% of the population. Paul Wolfowitz, the great visionary, publicly condemned the Turkish military because they didn't intervene to prevent the government from this sin, namely going along with 95% of the population. And he ordered them that they said, you're going to have to apologize to the United States for this and recognize that it's your duty to help Americans. He's the visionary who's leading the struggle to bring democracy to the Middle East. In fact, I cannot think, try the experiment, see if you can ever find anywhere in history such an exhibition of brazen, open contempt and hatred for democracy as in this entire display about old Europe, new Europe, Turkey, and so on. The good guys, like the old Russian satellites, they were obedient. They overruled a huge majority of the population, way more than France and Spain and Germany. And in fact, some of them even talked about it. The foreign minister of Latvia was asked why they went along with the United States, even though the population was overwhelmingly opposed. And he said, look, We know you have to say yes, sir, and obey the Americans. They understand that from a long history as Soviet satellites, and they still understand it. So they're the hope for democracy. This display is quite astonishing, and it's part of the reason why outside of U.S. editorial writers and commentators and U.S. intellectuals, nobody takes the democracy rhetoric seriously. It's not the only reason, but it's a part of the reason. I mean, that's not ancient history. That's just a couple of months ago. Incidentally, there are other reasons for this, like take the Middle East. In the whole Middle East region, there's one elected leader. One. Elected in reasonably fair elections. Yasser Arafat. Okay. The United States decided that they wanted to get rid of him. He wasn't doing his job of controlling the population the way he's supposed to. So right in the middle of all the democracy rhetoric, the Bush administration announced that Arafat's got to go, and instead they want Mahmoud Abbas. I mean, the press reported it. They also pointed out correctly that Abbas had no popular support, and Arafat was the elected leader the only leader who had a lot of support. But that never, you try to find anyone who said, okay, that illustrates that we're not supporting democracy. No, that illustrates that we're supporting democracy because we think Mahmoud Abbas will follow our orders, and Arafat doesn't seem to be doing it. So therefore it supports democracy to either kill or expel or suppress the only elected leader in the Middle East. How can you expect people there to take the rhetoric seriously? On the other hand, if you take a look at Bush's last speech about bringing democracy to the Middle East, this is discussed in Middle East journals. You take a look at the countries he praised and the countries for advancing towards democracy and the ones that he condemned. It had nothing to do with their attitude toward democracy. It had to do with whether they were following U.S. orders. No matter how brutal they were, how many people were being tortured in jail or anything else, or which direction things were going, if they were following U.S. orders, they were advancing toward democracy. You think people don't notice that in the Middle East or anywhere? Yeah, they notice it. I mean, it may not make the editorials and the commentaries and the journals and probably the classrooms here, but people who don't have the luxury of ignoring the world, they notice it. It takes a little effort not to see it.
Thank you.
Hi. My question is kind of directed towards the educational system in America and minorities. There seems to be an ongoing procedure to keep blacks especially uneducated so that, one, they're more vulnerable to being manipulated, and two, so that the American public believes they are the cause for a lot of crime and such. And also how the CIA is the main reason why the crack explosion of the 1980s took place. What do you think can be done to kind of make this aware to this huge population of minorities and to kind of work so that the educational system is, especially the public system in inner cities, is improved?
Well, I don't really think the CIA was involved in the crack epidemic. I'm skeptical about that, but the rest of what you said I think is not only true, but very dramatically and significantly true. In fact, the point isn't so much to keep the black population uneducated as to keep them in jail, especially black males. So since around 1980, if you go back to 1980, the prison population in the United States was, relative to population, was approximately the same as other industrial societies. By now, it's about 5 to 10 times as high as other industrial societies. Crime hasn't increased. In fact, it's decreased. Furthermore, crime in the United States is not particularly high as compared with comparable societies. It's within the spectrum of other industrial societies. But fear of crime is way beyond other societies. Same is true of drugs. Drug use is around the same as elsewhere. Fear of drugs is far beyond anyone else. It's very much like fear of Iraq. It's just unique in the United States. And this happens to be a very frightened society in many respects. It goes way back. I mean, when my kids were in school back around 1960, they were literally being taught to hide under desks to protect them from atom bomb attacks. I mean, aside from the idiocy of it, this was a technique to frighten them, and kids were afraid. I mean, children of friends of mine were contemplating suicide in the 60s because we're going to be attacked by the Red Chinese any minute with atom bombs. What's the point of doing anything? Fear of aliens is very high in the United States. Around half the population thinks there are aliens among us, and they have duck people and things like that. Nobody believes this anywhere. Right through the 80s, remember the current administration in Washington, those are the guys who were running the country from 1981 to 1992. They're basically recycled from the Reagan and Bush 1 administration. They had people terrified of everything. I mean, the United States was afraid of Grenada. You know, you can't find it. I mean, it's 100,000 people on a tight, you know, the nutmeg capital of the world. But Reagan invaded it and afterwards made a speech about how we're standing tall. You know, we succeeded in overcoming Grenada and protecting ourselves from an air base that the Russians were going to use if they could find it on a map to attack us. And that was taken seriously. I mean, in 1985, Reagan declared a national emergency in the United States because of the unusual and extraordinary threat to American security, U.S. security, posed by the government of Nicaragua, which was only 2 days driving time from Harlingen, Texas. You know, we had to tremble in fear before Nicaragua. You know, I mean, around the world, people couldn't figure out what's going on, you know. But it happened, and that's the way they held power for 12 years, pushing the panic button every year or so. Either it was Grenada or Nicaragua or Libya or crime in the streets or black criminals or so on. I mean, those of you who are old enough will remember how George Bush #1 won the 1988 election, playing a straight race card. You know, black criminals are going to rape your sister unless you vote for me. Willie Horton. That's what pushed him up in the polls. So it's real. The whole drug war, so-called, is a complete scam. I mean, it was, and it's known to be. It has almost nothing to do with ameliorating whatever problem drugs cause, and it's a problem, as in other countries. Everyone knows, and it's well known, there are very good studies showing that the most cost-effective way to deal with this by far is prevention and treatment. And that's barely funded. Actually, the last president who was really funding that was Richard Nixon, you know, the last liberal president, believe it or not. Now it's punishment. You know, punishment here, border controls, bombing, you know, fuming chemical warfare in the Andes, all of which are known to have almost no effect on drug use, very limited. But they have other purposes, and one of them domestically is what you said. It's a kind of a counterinsurgency program against superfluous people. The poor, race and class tend to be fairly closely correlated in the United States, so it ends up being mostly blacks, secondarily Latinos. It's just getting rid of poor people who don't have any, we have no use for the rich and privileged. And the way you do it here is toss them in jail. And it continues to go up. I mean, it's not Republicans. I mean, Clinton increased the prison population by roughly 50%, mostly black males, secondarily Latino males, by now women too, and a tremendous percentage of them on victimless crimes, meaning, you know, kids caught with a joint or something like that. And that's very class-based. I mean, you know, the police can go into Roxbury and arrest some kid who has a joint in his pocket, but they can't, where I live in Lexington, you know, upper middle class suburb, the police can't go into somebody's home and, you know, or find them in the street, some executive who's going home to snort cocaine in the evening. You can't do that. If they try that, they'll be in jail, not the guy they're going after. In Roxbury, they can do it. And in fact, if you take a look at, I should say, all right, I'll go on with this if you like, but go ahead with your question. There's a lot more to say about it.
Since education is the most important tool, obviously, is how we're learning this, what is your suggestion to improving the education?
Tell people, children should be taught the truth. Like you said, it's a simple value. There's the truth about these things is not very obscure. You can read it in any criminology book. Nobody doubts it very much. The things I've just said are, they're not obscure. They're well known. There's a lot more like it, and that's what people should understand. It's correct to teach children that they shouldn't use drugs. It's harmful. Tobacco is even more harmful. Alcohol's probably even more harmful. Red meat is harmful. Coffee is harmful. There's a lot of things that are harmful, and people should know about that. And in fact, if you look back at the timing of the Bush administration's drug war, 1989 they launched the drug war. If you took a look at trends in statistical trends in the population, they were very dramatic. Through the peak use of marijuana was around, I think, 1979, but that was also a low point of criminalization. It was technically illegal, but very few people were arrested for it. The reason is they were people like you. They were students in colleges. You don't go after them. Through the 1980s, there was a decline in use of just about anything among educated and wealthier people. So there was a decline in smoking, in drug use, hard drugs, red meat, coffee. Everything went down. It was part of a whole lifestyle change, but it was restricted to more educated and wealthier sectors. In fact, I remember among the poor, it stayed sort of steady. Those changes didn't take place. Whatever the processes were that led to them didn't take place among the poor. Now you take a look where those trend lines were going. When they called the drug war, it's pretty clear what was going to happen. They were going to go after poor, black, Latino, and so on. And that was understood. There was one senator, Daniel Moynihan, who was a social scientist who paid attention to social statistics. And he stated at the time, right on the floor of the Senate, he said, look, if we call this drug war, now we are declaring a crime wave among minorities. And that's correct. And that's what they did, and that's why they did it. And in fact, that's the whole history of prohibition is like this. Prohibition is very typically, for centuries, going after what are called the dangerous classes. The people you want to control, you're afraid of, you want to control. The poor, the black, or whatever. In fact, I heard a speech by the major legal historian of prohibition, wrote the main book on marijuana, about 15 years ago. He was giving a speech to the Judges Association of California, and he went through the history of prohibition. He predicted then that tobacco was going to be criminalized. It was going to be criminalized because if you look at the way the trend lines were going, it was being used more and more by poor people. And as it became localized among the poor, it would get criminalized. And that's just what's happening. In Massachusetts, for example, it's effectively criminalized. And one way or another, that's spreading around the country. And the drugs are the same. You criminalize things that the dangerous classes are doing, and it's a way of keeping you under control. And that's the main reason why the black population in jail is going out of sight. It's a real, it's a horror story for the populations. It's devastating to the communities. It's devastating for their future. And there's no reason why children in school shouldn't know what every criminologist writes about this.
Thanks a lot for speaking with us today, Mr. Chomsky. You've been a great inspiration. Right now I'm working on a documentary addressing some issues around media consolidation, i.e. the 1996 Telecommunications Act, things like that were passed on June 2nd of this year. We're addressing the effects of media consolidation on local music cultures, but we're also drawing the implications to our democracy. And I'm wondering if you'd like to comment a little bit about media consolidation and these things.
Well, the best, I don't know anything about the music business, so I'm sure it's the same.
That's fine.
I just live in a different universe. But as for the news media, those, the press, television, so on, there is a good, steady record of consolidation that's published every couple of years. It's a book called The Media Monopoly by Ben Bagdikian, who was a long record, history in the media. He was head of the journalism school at Berkeley for a long time, Berkeley, California. And what he shows, if you take a look at the successive editions of the book, it's pretty dramatic. I think the first edition, back around early 80s, there were roughly 50 major centers of control for the national media. The last edition, I think it was down to about 8 or something like that. Furthermore, it's getting internationalized so that bookstores, newspapers, and so on are owned by international conglomerates. A lot of them are owned in Germany, places like that. So yes, there's a very narrow, there's a sharp narrowing of alternatives available. Michael Powell has been, Federal Communications Commission has been trying to reduce it still further. There's a battle going on in Congress about this. And the effects are, again, you don't have to be a genius to figure out the effects. The more consolidation there is, the less variety and opportunity there is. And that's the point of it, in fact. How much effect it has on the media product is another question. And it's not so obvious, because even when you have competing media, which are major corporations, linked to one another and to the state, they're going to say more or less the same thing, even if they're somewhat competing with one another. So when you have a corporate media system, the variety is going to be pretty narrow. If you look back in American history or British history, let's take just New England, this area where we live. You go back to, say, the 1850s, early Industrial Revolution. There was a very lively and active working class press, a press based in the working class and in ethnic communities all over New England, all the places where the Industrial Revolution was going on, like Lowell and Lawrence. There was a really exciting working class press written by and run by the people there. Young women who were taken off the farms, who were called factory girls, Irish, artisans from Boston, whatever they were. And that was that's probably the period of the freest press in the history of the country. It gradually, the same in England. The period of greatest freedom of the press and variety of the press in England was around the same time, mid-19th century. In England, there were significant efforts to try to block it by taxation, by censorship, by state control, and so on. None of them worked. There's too many ways to evade it. But it was finally understood that the way to do it is by capital concentration and advertiser reliance. So if you have concentration of capital and funding by advertisers, over time it's going to turn out that the media are run by the business world. Okay, obviously. They're the ones who can concentrate the capital, they can have the glitz and this, that, and the other thing, and they'll be funded by advertisers. Advertisers aren't going to fund a working class newspaper that's calling for workers to take over plants, as they were doing in Lowell and Lawrence 150 years ago. But they will fund newspapers that are trying to marginalize people and suppress their independence and make them passive and so on and so forth, and believe the right things. And over time, that's what happens. In England, it took until the 1960s. Till the 1960s, the biggest newspaper in England, which actually had larger circulation than all the major papers combined, was the Daily Herald. And it also had a lot of readership loyalty. You know, people read it, were concerned, involved in it, and so on. But it was a working-class newspaper, and it simply could not compete in the capital markets. Couldn't get advertising, couldn't amass capital, and it finally went under. In the United States, that happened earlier. This is more of a business-run society. So much earlier, the independent community and working-class press pretty much disappeared. Although not, it's not that far back. I mean, even in the 1950s, there were still about 800 labor newspapers that reached about 20 or 30 million people. Then that's disappeared. By now we only have corporate media. And once you have only corporate media, the range of opinion and attitude and so on is going to be pretty narrow. It gets even narrower if you have consolidation. But the big effect, I think, is prior to the consolidation, if you look at it.
Thanks a lot.
Mine's actually a follow-up to that. I was wondering, what do you think, as far as potential creators, distributors, or more importantly, consumers of media, what do you think we could do to dissuade the mix from happening?
Well, you can do a lot. So, I mean, with all the consolidation and the controls and, corporate ownership and so on, there's plenty of opportunities. And, in fact, they're not used. Like take Boston, where we live. A lot of people here, young activists, are very much concerned and rightly concerned over these questions of media consolidation, corporate media propaganda, and so on and so forth. How rotten the Boston Globe is and the whole story. On the other hand, they're not using resources that are right in front of their eyes. Like every town in Boston, and in fact around the country, has a cable station, community cable station. They're there because when the laws were passed, 30 years ago, granting cable monopolies, Congress stuck something in requiring the cable company that got a monopoly in some area to establish community-based public access television. Well, you go down to, say, the Cambridge station. I mean, it's not CBS, but by international standards, people would die for it in most of the world. And it's there. You can get to it. You can use it. They don't really have much in the way of controls. It's more or less available to anybody who wants to use it. Almost nobody's using it for any sensible purpose. There are a few towns where they're being used, but not much. Well, that's an opportunity that's sitting right there. And there are plenty of others. We should learn something from what people do under conditions of real repression and harsh conditions, like take, say, Brazil, which is a much more lively democratic culture than we do, far more. And we could learn a lot from it. Just about 6 years ago, I was in Brazil, actually traveling around with Lula, the guy who's now president. And the one thing he took me to was a suburb of Rio de Janeiro. The suburbs in Brazil are kind of like Europe. The suburbs are the poor areas. The rich people live inside. It's inverted from the U.S. So we went out to some poor working-class suburb of a couple of million people, fairly miserable. And it's a sort of semi-tropical country, so a lot of people are outside. There's public squares and people milling around in the evening and so on. Well, there was a project, that's what we went to see, a small NGO, couple of people, couple of professionals, professional media people, had tried to establish community-based television in the poor suburbs. And the way they did it was almost pennies. They had a truck which had a big screen that you could stick up on the roof and some sound equipment and so on. And by the time we were there, there had been enough organization in the community, so they went out to a public square in one of these communities, and at prime TV time, like 9 o'clock, they were broadcasting in the public square programs acted, produced, written by people in the community. were people, little education. And they were, I don't understand Portuguese, but I could follow it enough to sort of see what was going on, and it was explained to me. It was a mixture of entertainment, clown or something like that, and very serious skits about racism, about the debt, all kinds of things that people care about. And they were all intermingled. One of the young actresses, looked about 17, who was on screen, was also walking around. There's a big mass of people there, families and so on, hundreds of people milling around. She was walking around the crowd with a microphone, asking people to comment on what they had just seen. And they were filmed. So you saw them commenting on it, and then somebody sitting in a bar somewhere would say he wanted to comment, and he'd film him, and so on. And there was a real lively, ongoing public community television reaching a large number of people right in prime time for pennies. I mean, they can do it in Brazil, and we can't do it here. That doesn't make sense. We could do way more than that. And the technology is available. I mean, you know a lot more about it than I do, I'm sure, but the technology is available. There are all sorts of means of reaching people from, everything from the internet to cable television to desktop printing to all sorts of stuff, which is by now pretty cheap and easily usable. And it could create alternative media, which would overwhelm the major media, which people tend not to trust anyway. Trust in the media is way down, rightly, but people don't have an alternative, and alternatives are potentially there. It takes talent and energy and commitment to use them, but you're not going to face what people face in Brazil: extreme poverty, repressive security forces, and so on. We don't have any of those problems. So yeah, there's a lot of things that could be done.
Real quick, I know you were saying you didn't really focus too much on music, but I was wondering if you think maybe music could be effective in dissuading consolidation. If you think that could be an effective tool.
I'm way out of my depth here, I should say. My musical experiences are sort of from the 1940s and before, but there's no doubt. You guys know this way better than I do, but the young youth music cultures are very politically alive. I mean, I know this even from my own peripheral experience. Actually, during the first Iraq War, I was approached by a punk rock group called Bad Religion. I don't know, maybe you know who it is, but okay, I haven't heard of it. And they said, would I mind talking for 8 minutes about the Iraq War? Okay, so they sent me a tape recorder, and I talked for 8 minutes on the tape recorder, and then a little while later I got a record, I think a 45 probably, or whatever they used then, which on one side had something called a song. Don't ask me, but it was called a song. And I was told it was an anti-war song. And the other side was my 8 minutes. Actually, I sent the record to a friend who had a 14-year-old daughter and asked her if she could decode the song for me. And she wrote me a very erudite analysis of what the song was and its political content and everything else. Well, that record, I had more outreach around the world than any book I've ever written. I mean, everywhere I was, in the United States or abroad, I was getting asked by young people to sign the record. So I'm told that that's not unusual, that there are, I don't want to, I'm telling you things you know much better than I do, but so you can confirm it if it's true or correct it if it's wrong. But what I'm told is that among young people around the world, in fact, this is a source of a lot of inspiration, creativity, activism, education, and so on. And if it is, yeah, every reason to foster it.
given that, or thinking of that, what's important in looking into the election? Like, what factors do you think are important to consider?
Well, first of all, it's all reversible. I mean, we have a tremendous amount of privilege and freedom, just incomparable. There's nothing in the world like it. The question is, do we want to use it? I mean, even with this administration in office, everything is reversible. I mean, they can act to a certain extent. They cannot counteract organized, active public opinion. I mean, you can't even do that in a dictatorship. It's almost impossible in a more free society. That's why there's so much propaganda, to try to prevent people from using the power that they have, either by marginalizing them or isolating them or making them passive consumers or making them feel hopeless or whatever. A huge amount of effort goes into that. Like probably $1 trillion a year goes into marketing, which is mostly just attitude control. Try to make people passive, consumers who don't do anything. But they don't have to agree to that. You can change it. Again, Brazil is a striking case. Here's a dramatic case right in the hemisphere. It's a real lesson in democracy. Lula, who I mentioned, was just elected president. I mean, that's inconceivable in the United States, that a popular figure coming out, and they're a poor peasant coming out of the labor organizer, would be able to be elected president, put in power by massive popular movements, which were able to overcome, first of all, severe repression, also concentration of capital, concentration of media that goes way beyond anything we have here. But over decades, they were able to develop a kind of a democratic culture which made that possible. If you could do it in Brazil in 20 years under those conditions, we ought to be able to do it here in 2 years under easy conditions. And it would affect whoever is up there saying, I'm your leader. And you could get better candidates, too, at every level, from local representatives up to president. It's all available, and there isn't anything much that can be done to stop it. I mean, the means of controlling people by violence have mostly disappeared in countries like the United States. In fact, if you look at the history of propaganda, some good histories of it, you'll notice that propaganda really developed most massively in the more free societies, like the public relations industry, which is essentially a huge propaganda agency, developed in England and the United States, the most free societies around a century ago. And if you look back at the records, it was developing precisely out of a very conscious understanding on the part of privileged sectors, elites, that they were losing the capacity to control the population by force. Just people had won too much freedom. They wouldn't submit to force, and you couldn't do it. So therefore you had to control attitudes and opinions. And the way you do that is in part by indoctrination in the school system and the news and that sort of thing. But in large part, the way of controlling opinions and attitudes was understood right away to be inducing hopelessness, making people feel helpless and isolated, separate them from one another, make sure they don't interact. Like the ideal society would be based on dyads, you and the tube, but no further interaction among people, because that's dangerous. And a lot of what's been going on over the last century and is going on right at this moment is about that. Let's take the Medicare business in Congress. What's it about? Any rational analyst, this article in the Boston Globe this morning, but everyone in the health care business knows perfectly well that we have an extremely inefficient health care system. It's far more costly than anywhere else in the world. It has huge bureaucratic costs. It imposes all sorts of administrative burdens and so on. And the health outcomes are not that good, nowhere near the highest in the industrial world. And now they're going to try to make it worse by introducing, one of the core elements of the current bill is what they call competition between publicly subsidized private health plans and the National Health Plan. And the idea of that is to try to ensure that the insurance companies and so on will be able to cherry pick. They'll be able to pull off the healthy people, insure them. Prices for everyone else will go up. You'll be driven off the public system. Well, that's part of the effort to destroy the public system, like destroying Social Security and schools, for that matter, or any of these things. Well, why such a tremendous effort to destroy them? Because it is understood. I mean, there's no economic motive for it. In fact, the economic motives are the opposite. But it is understood that things like Medicare, Social Security, schools, other such things are based on an unacceptable principle that has to be driven out of people's minds. It's the principle that you're supposed to care about somebody else, okay? That you're supposed to care as a member of a democratic community. You're supposed to care whether the widow on the other side of town starves. And you've got to drive that out of people's heads because if people have those ideas, they might act on them. And if they act on them, they're going to dismantle the whole system of domination and control. So those ideas have to be driven out of people's heads. They have to be made to believe that their entire worth depends on their own consumption of useless commodities. And that's driven into kids' heads from infancy. I mean, I watch television with my grandchildren. You know, you watch these 2-year-old kids just getting this stuff driven into their heads. In fact, there's even a subject in applied psychology now on what's actually called nagging. There's an analysis of, there's been a huge problem for the advertising industry of how to get young kids who don't have money to be consumers. Young children are called potential consumers, not children. So how do you get them to use that potential? Well, the only way they can use it is by getting their parents to buy things. So there's a study of nagging, the different kinds of ways in which children can nag their parents. You know, apparently there's half a dozen different varieties of nagging, and you can cultivate those. And they'll drive their parents crazy, and parents will buy them, you know, some $500 toy that they'll throw away tomorrow. You know, that's crucial. I mean, that's the way you turn people into automata. You control them, separate them from one another, drive any human instinct out of their heads, make them see themselves as, you know, nothing in life except adding to my useless commodities. And I don't care about anybody else because you're not supposed to care. If you can get to that point, then you really have people under control. You don't need security forces. And that has been a major effort for the past century. It gets more and more sophisticated, more and more money goes into it all the time. Those are techniques of control, but you don't have to submit to them. You know, they're very fragile systems. I mean, if people are unwilling to submit to them, they just go away. You know, it's not like it's not like the security forces in a totalitarian state who don't go away. You know, they go away. They persist only because people subordinate themselves to them, which means that there's a lot of opportunity and hope for change, but it's going to take some effort. You know?
Last question. Hi. My question actually goes back to corporate media. About 2 days ago, the New York Times ran an article in which the FBI sent out a memo to most law enforcement agencies on how to deal with protesters. What my question to you is sort of reflect upon how far do you think the government's going to go along with the media to sort of smother this opposition to the war, and to anytime anyone sort of doesn't go with the natural flow of the government, how far do you think they go? And how?
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
It's a bad thing, but we shouldn't exaggerate. As compared with almost anyone else in the world, we're facing a paper tiger. The FBI is the national political police. Okay, it was established to be a political police. It was established by Woodrow Wilson during what was called the Red Scare, which was far worse than any repression that's happened since. It was very serious. They devastated the labor movement. They kicked thousands of people out of the country. I mean, the leading Well, you mentioned Eugene. Was it you who mentioned Eugene Debs? Somebody did. I heard somebody mention his name. Nobody. Anyway, Eugene Debs, who was the leading figure in the American labor movement ever, in fact, and presidential candidate and so on. He was tossed into jail by Wilson during this because he raised critical questions about the war. You weren't allowed to do that. That's the time when the FBI was formed, and that's been their role. They also look after car thefts and stuff, but this has been the primary role. And they're just a national political police. I mean, if you haven't read about it, you should read about COINTELPRO. In fact, if we valued our freedom, that would be taught in elementary school. The COINTELPRO, which was exposed around the same time as Watergate, was a long program by the National Political Police going back through the Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon administrations to a subversive program of the National Political Police to undermine every popular movement. It started with all the black movements, the women's movement, the anti-war movement, everything. And it was no joke. It went up to the level of political assassination. It wasn't a joke. One of the leading black organizers, Fred Hampton, was just murdered in a Gestapo-style assassination set up by the FBI. They used the Chicago police to do it. All this stuff was exposed around the same time as Watergate. I mean, in comparison, Watergate was a Tea Party. It didn't even exist. But this just disappeared, and Watergate became a huge issue. Simple reason. Watergate, which was very minor, nothing much happened. They went after people with power. You don't do that. People with power will kill you. So you go after, say, the Democratic Party, which is half of the wealth and power in the country. You're not going to get away with it. On the other hand, if you murder Fred Hampton, that's okay. Nobody cares about that. The civil libertarians don't even notice it. And the same is true across the board. But COINTELPRO was a very serious program. Actually, and there's nothing like it now as far as we know. I mean, there are disruptive attempts, but they're not like that. The anti-war movement back in the 60s, those of you who are, say, my age, or younger, in fact, will remember, we didn't know the details about COINTELPRO, but you knew it was going on. So I was personally active in resistance groups. And every group, whether it was resistance or, civil disobedience or just plain organizing demonstrations, every group that was at all sophisticated took for granted that there were FBI infiltrators in the group. And you could usually even pick them out. If some guy is, dressed like sort of a movie version of a hippie and is shouting off the cops and so on, you can be pretty sure that he's going to show up as a government informant in the next trial. So people kind of identified them and kept away from them and so on. But we did, if we were doing something serious, like helping deserters get out of the country, we'd always do it in affinity groups where you knew the people, because you just knew that no matter how close the group was, probably infiltrated. And you take that for granted, telephone, internet, and so on, and you just go around it. But the fact of the matter is it is a very fragile system. As compared with other places in the world, we're very well off. I mean, you're not well off if you're a black organizer in the ghetto, say Fred Hampton. But for people who have any kind of share in privilege, and that's a huge number of people in a country as rich as this, they're pretty well protected. And that means, you keep your eye on it, but not exaggerate. I mean, in, say, Colombia, which I mentioned, people doing what we're doing would be facing the threat, serious threat of assassination. There are about 20 political assassinations a day. We're not worried about that. If you go to, say, Turkey, which is quite different, the intellectual classes are very different from here or anywhere in the West, and very impressive. I mean, you go to Turkey, which is a pretty repressive state, leading writers, musicians, artists, academics, journalists are not only protesting constantly against the harsh laws, but they're carrying out regular civil disobedience, and facing serious penalties. It's not fun to be in a Turkish jail. But they do it all the time, unpretentiously. You know, I've been there. They don't make a fuss about it. I've even joined in some. They just do it regularly. That's what you do. And the penalties are far harsher than anything that we can dream about. So, yeah, all of these things are right, and we should be concerned about them. But, you know, by the scale of what has happened in the past or what happens elsewhere, it's not a huge problem. You know, and bad, and you should stop it, but shouldn't deter anyone.
Thank you, Noam Chomsky, for coming to speak to us. Thank you for coming.